At long last, after the many ups and downs, through either his own lack of judgment or the sheer hardships of life, Abraham is finally given a son by Sarah in Genesis 21, and the covenant between himself and God is actualized in the way the Bible tells us God had intended. We are told, "Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah, as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had promised him." The Bible speaks of God as being gracious to Sarah, which in this instance he is, in that he keeps his word to both her and Abraham by ensuring a safe delivery of a healthy boy, despite her age. The lesson that can be derived from this section of the passage, much as it has been the case in many of the passages so far, is that God always delivers on the promises he makes, regardless of how outlandish they may seem. Indeed, it had taken 25 years in the case of the covenant, but it did come to fruition, which seeks to teach believers that one must be patient in the things they ask of God, and that he will deliver when the time is right. We learn that Abraham names his son Isaac, as instructed to him back in Genesis 17, and that when he was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him in accordance with the covenant. The Bible portrays this as a joyous moment and something of a personal achievement of both Abraham and Sarah, who despite their trials and tribulations in their eventful and long lives, were still able to coincide, and better yet, produce a miracle baby. Whilst the chapter is more of a celebration of Isaac's miraculous birth, the chapter could just as easily be dedicated to Abraham and Sarah, who not only endured infidelity, the harshities of war in Siddim, the entanglements in Egypt, the animosity of Hagar, Abimelech's kidnapping of Sarah, and even Nimrod in some stories, they still stayed together, and in the end, thrived. Sarah confirms her joy, saying, "God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me." And she added, "Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age." In a way, Abraham and Sarah become an exemplary image of what a marriage under God should be. Two people who come together and cultivate a profound sense of joy. And indeed, whilst both parties do make some critical mistakes, and not ones I personally condone, both Abraham and Sarah are able to forgive each other and end up producing something very special in Isaac. But of course, once Sarah has what she wants, some might say she becomes quite bitter when a great feast is held to celebrate Isaac. Sarah notices Ishmael mocking the baby Isaac, and in a fit of rage, she tells Abraham to banish both Ishmael and his mother, for she does not want either of them to share in Isaac's inheritance. For a more complete analysis of this part of the story, you might wish to check out the episode on Ishmael, where I pick apart and analyse both the nature of Sarah's attitude here and the fate of Ishmael and his mother Hagar. For those of you who are more familiar with this part of the Bible, however, we understand that Abraham becomes distressed over his wife's request to banish Hagar and Ishmael, for Ishmael was still his son after all. Therefore he consults God, and God promises Abraham that he will ensure Ishmael will thrive, for he is an offspring of Abraham, and thus a part of the covenant. He tells him, "Do not be distressed about the boy and your slave woman. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. I will make the son of the slave into a nation also, because he is your offspring." We also see here the imperativeness of Isaac, and that Abraham should be doing whatever it is that Sarah tells him to, at least when it comes to Isaac, because Isaac must come first from now on. The statement that through Isaac, Abraham's offspring will be reckoned is also quite important to note, for it is through Isaac's offspring that the Messiah is eventually born. It could also be theorized that Isaac's birth brought Abraham and Sarah closer together, and that God did not want to jeopardize their relationship and cause distress for Isaac. Therefore, he believed it best to separate Hagar and Ishmael from the equation, and to prevent the bad blood from spilling over any further. In any case, Abraham, Sarah, and Isaac become the family that they always envisioned, and Hagar and Ishmael are able to flourish, with the Bible telling us that he does indeed become the father of many great nations. Essentially, there is a happy ending for everyone. The Bible then tells us that at the same time of Isaac's feast, the king Abimelech and the commander of his forces, named Phicol, approach Abraham, and they tell him, "God is with you in everything you do. Now swear to me here before God, that you will not deal falsely with me or my children or my descendants. Show to me and the country where you now reside as a foreigner the same kindness I have shown you." You might remember that Abimelech was described as a pagan king in the previous chapter of Genesis. But after having spoken directly with the Lord, he seems to now recognize God as the only authority, or at least understands the bond between Abraham and God, which is why he asks Abraham to swear before him. His request isn't exactly a greedy one either. All he asks is for Abraham to treat him and his descendants fairly, and doesn't try to cheat or swindle them out of anything. To this, Abraham readily agrees to. There is some interpretation to be done in this passage. But firstly, there are some ideas that this Abimelech is not the same Abimelech from the previous chapter, and is instead a different king who just so happens to have the same name. Yet another idea proposes that Abimelech is no name at all, but instead a title given to the king of the Canaanites. By this, the man in question could have virtually been anyone, though it does seem quite random that he would meet with Abraham and ask him to show the kindness that he had showed him. This is most likely in reference to Abimelech giving Sarah back to Abraham, and going as far as to accommodate him by allowing him to live anywhere in the land, as opposed to running him out of town, which he technically had a right to do, after the shame that Abraham had brought upon him. Furthermore, the fact that he asks Abraham to swear that he will not deal with him or his children falsely might also echo Abraham's previous act of being false, when he passed off Sarah as his sister instead of declaring her as his wife. Abimelech here seeks to avoid all of that going forward, and once he has Abraham's word before God, it likely reassured him that Abraham had learned his lesson, and would not do such a thing again. We then see a back and forth between Abraham and Abimelech, where Abraham raises concerns over Abimelech's expansion and the seizing of a water well that was on Abraham's property. The Bible tells us, "Then Abraham complained to Abimelech about a well of water that Abimelech's servants had seized. But Abimelech said, 'I don't know who has done this. You did not tell me, and I heard about it only today.'" The well might not seem like much of a big deal, but in Canaan, there were no reliable rivers that one could acquire water from, and there was a great reliance upon the rain. Therefore, the well became an important strategic place to hold on the landscape, something that was apparently within the boundary that Abraham had marked as his property. We see Abraham proceed to rebuke Abimelech for the wrong committed by his servants who had taken the well, and perhaps it can be said that Abraham loses any fear that he might have previously had of Abimelech for the sake of his family and people, but most notably his newborn son, who would need the water to survive. Whilst there appears to be a discrepancy between Abraham and Abimelech over the well, and what some might perceive to be a violation of Abimelech's own stipulation, the matter is quickly remedied as the two men make a treaty. We are told, "So Abraham brought sheep and cattle and gave them to Abimelech, and the two men made a treaty. Abraham set apart 7 lambs from the flock, and Abimelech asked Abraham, "What is the meaning of these 7 lambs you have set apart by themselves?" Much like how animals were sacrificed to form the covenant between Abraham and God, the same was likely true for Abraham and Abimelech. Furthermore, in relation to Abimelech's questioning of why 7 lambs were set apart, these were most likely gifts from Abraham to Abimelech in an effort to compensate the king for his loss of the well. In this, Abraham proves to be the antithesis of greedy, for he could have very easily kept the well and the lambs for himself. He also demonstrates compassion by recognizing the struggle that Abimelech will face without the well. By accepting the lambs, it can also be seen as recognition on Abimelech's behalf that the well was well and truly Abraham's, and that there could be no dispute of this fact going forward. In a way, some might say the 7 lambs were payment from Abraham to Abimelech for the well, a well which Abraham claims to have dug himself, as he tells, "Accept these 7 lambs from my hand, as a witness that I dug this well." In the closing chapter, we understand that the place of the well was named Beersheba, because the 2 men had sworn an oath there. Beersheba would come to be an important place in the continuation of Israel's history, and can often be interpreted to mean watering place or the well of 7, perhaps in reference to the 7 lambs that Abraham traded to mark it as his own. Once the treaty had been established, Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his forces, appeared to return to the land of the Philistines. The Bible tells us that after this, Abraham planted a tamarisk tree there in Beersheba, that which would come to be seen as a symbolic representation of his own bloodline, and the future men who were spawned out of his genealogy, for like them, the tree would take a long time to fully grow. We also learn that Abraham stayed here in the land of the Philistines for a long time, and that despite having already actualized the covenant, he still called upon the name of the Lord, showing that even in his elderly years of peace, he kept a relationship with his God. Believers may derive a lesson from this, in that just because one gets what they want, they should not abandon their faith in God. In Abraham's case, his achievement of what he wanted only brought him closer to God, and though he was old and had little else to achieve now, he found comfort in the Lord after the journey they had taken together. Furthermore, Abraham's continued relationship with God shows his gratitude, for without him, he would not have all that he would come to have. In this, gratitude becomes a key takeaway for believers, and that success and actualization are not necessarily the final destination, for you never know when God might have more planned for you, as Abraham soon realizes. But that's all we have time for today on Biblical Stories Explained. As always, if you've enjoyed today's video, then don't forget to give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe for more content just like this. Until next time.